Okay, so here in the text, what we have here is we have a prophet by the name of Elijah. And then we also have someone who is actually going to succeed him by the name of Elisha. Y'all see that in the text? So here we have Elijah let me give you some background. Elijah had been speaking with God. He had been complaining to God. He had a threat that was against him that caused him to be on the run. He ended up going to the mountain of God and having this conversation with God. Really what he's doing is he's venting to God. In the midst of him venting to God, God gives him some instructions for him to do. Elijah is a prophet of God. And the instruction was for him to anoint 3 people. He was to anoint a king by the name of, to anoint a man by the name of Hazael to be king over Aram. He was to anoint a man by the name of Jehu to be king over Israel. And he was to anoint Elisha to succeed him as prophet. Because Elijah had got to the place to where he was tired. He had, after the greatest point in his ministry, he received a threat from a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel. A lot of times y'all even hear people used to use that term about calling people Jezebels and all that kind of stuff. Well, anyway, she was married to the king of Israel at the time, and basically what she was one of them women that really, instead of the husband being really in charge, who was really in charge was her. But she was wicked. And so he had ran away because she had threatened him. And so he ran away and he was complaining to God, and he was basically just in a very depressed state, if you will. And so in the midst of him talking to God and sharing his grievance with God, God gave him instructions to anoint 3 people. And I named those people, Hazael, who would be king over Aram, Jehu would be king over Israel, and then he is to anoint someone who is to succeed him, named Elisha. So he executes this assignment from God. And so he goes, and here in the text we find he is now going to anoint Elisha. And while he's on his way to anoint Elisha is at work. He's working the family business. This family is known to be a family that had a little bit of money, right? And so he's walking behind. He has these 12 yokes of oxen, and he's walking behind the 12. And so he's at work. And so while he's at work, Elijah the prophet comes and he casts his mantle on him. Some may ask, well, what is a mantle? A mantle was like a coat, like it was a cloak. It was a covering that is symbolic for what prophets wear. Are y'all with me? Mm-hmm. So what he's doing, instead of him saying to Elijah, the Lord told me to, do X, Y, and Z, he shows him by passing by him and throwing his mantle. And remember, he is going to see. This is the person who God is using to succeed him. So he's taking his mantle off, he's casting it on Elijah, and he walks away. And so today, what I want us to draw from this particular text is how to embrace God's will. How to embrace God's will. Because again, it is God's will for Elijah to succeed Elijah. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we have this idea especially when we first come to Christ, we're on fire for God. We want to do God's will. But sometimes there comes a time in our life where sometimes God's will may be things that may not appeal to our eyes. Have you ever been called to do something by God that has been kind of scary? I remember early in my Christian walk when I got serious about God, I was on fire for God. I was this new Christian, and the very thing that I said, I'll do anything for God except preach. Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. Anything but preach. Because I wasn't one of those students in school that sat in the front. I was actually one of the ones that sat in the back. And I wasn't one of those ones that caught on easy. I'm the kind that learned by illustration. You got to tell me a story to go along with something. And so I never was, I never was one that got really, really good grades. If I got a D1 and that was scholarly to me, okay? And so I wasn't one of those one that grasped things good. And to give you a little background of my high school life, I spent more time outside of high school than I did in the classroom. I was always, you ever heard of cutting school?
Yeah.
As soon as my mom would go one way, I would dip around and go another way. So that's what I did. So I didn't actually graduate high school. I ended up getting a GED. I've only had my GED probably about less than 20 years ago. Okay? So to be called to preach, and I've been exposed to some great preachers, I never even thought that would even be possible. And I was always afraid to talk in front of people, especially when you have to teach them. Who gonna teach what? How am I gonna be called to preach or teach when I struggled in school? And part of some of the reasons why I might have cut is because I didn't want to face the fact that I really had a hard time grasping things. Because how many know that when you show that you're not really that strong academically, sometimes people point that out and tease you. And I was always one of the popular people at school, so I didn't want nobody to know that I struggled in school. So what's the better way to get around that? Dip. Cut school, right?
Yeah.
And so here I am. I had said that to God, but then in 2000, he showed me in 2005, I really didn't understand the vision that he was showing me, but then he audibly called me in 2012, May 10th, 2012, matter of fact. And I heard his voice audibly call me to preach. And so, a lot of times, even though he was calling me to preach, it scared the mess out of me. There are some things that is God's will that he'll call you to, and you're like, oh, yeah, cool, that'd be cool. But then there's some things that God will call you to that scares the mess out of you. But here he is. Here's Elijah running the family business. The text doesn't tell us how long, but he's running the family business. He's at work, and all of a sudden, there's this call on his life. He's called to succeed Elijah. He's not given a lot of explanation. All he receives is this mantle, which symbolizes the prophetic office. That symbolizes you're being called into ministry. And many of us, just like Elijah, will be called from something. Not all of us will be called to preach. I don't want to scare nobody. This ain't one of these calls. You'll know if you've been called to preach. You'll feel God calling you to preach. You can't get around it. It's something you can't get over. But there's things that God calls us from to call us to. Many of us have been called from a life of addiction, right? But when God calls you from something, he's also calling you to something. And so here he is. He's being called from his occupation. Something that's all he knows. He was called to the prophetic, but he's working a secular job. And also what I want us to see is God can call you anywhere. He's in a field. Where do you plow at? In the field, in open country, right? And on a farm, right? So your calling doesn't necessarily have to come in the four walls of a church, right? He's calling him in the field. He's calling him in the midst of what he's doing. And that also shares with us that God can interrupt our lives when we least expect it. Again, he's not at church where he's praising the Lord and all of a sudden he hears the Lord calling. He's at work, minding his own business, doing what he's doing. And there's going to be times in our life, if it hasn't already happened, where God is going to call you from something. He's going to interrupt your life. He didn't wait to be invited. Oftentimes he's an uninvited guest, right? He doesn't wait to be invited. He doesn't wait until, let me see, is he off work yet? Then I'll call. When God is ready for us to do something, he don't make an appointment. He doesn't check your calendar. He doesn't check to see if you have a degree.
That's right.
When he called me to preach, he didn't say, at the time when he called me to preach, I had only had my GED maybe a couple of years at that. He doesn't ask you what your resume is. He just interrupts your life. There's times in our life where God's will interrupt our life. He's working. Nothing wrong with working, right? Sometimes we think God calls us just away from bad stuff. But he can call us away from things that we are used to. Something that, there's nothing wrong with working, right? There was no crime in what he was doing. But he's calling him away from that. And he's calling him into the prophetic. He didn't say, well, you gotta have some, your resume must say that you qualify for this. There's going to be many of us who God is going to call us away from mediocrity. And he's going to call us and elevate us. Because you may think that your past might hold you hostage to things that, I just got to take these little old jobs because, my record or my past or, or my pedigree, I don't have all the education, I don't have all the degrees. But God can open some doors. Anybody anybody he calls, he will qualify.
Yes, sir.
I have very limited ministry training. I've never been to seminary school, but yet and still, are y'all getting something out when I'm there? Evidently, y'all guys are coming back every week, and I know y'all ain't just coming just to hang, right? Right? And so again, he's in his element. He's working a job, probably a lucrative business. He's got 12 yokes of oxen. But even though he's in a lucrative business, God is still calling him away from it. And so now he has to make a decision to leave that he knows behind. Can you imagine working for a Fortune 500 company making 6 figures and the Lord calls you into ministry? Many of us will be like, is that you, Lord? We don't know. That might be a false prophet. But sometimes what God calls us from, it doesn't make sense. He's working the family business. That was what was supposed to happen. Sons work their father's business. You keep your father's sheep like David did. You work the family business. That's your inheritance. That's how you're going to live. That's how you're going to eat. But he's saying, I'm calling you from, and I'm calling you to. So what can we feel God calling us from? Or in fact, if he has already called you from, the question now remains, what is he calling you to? Why did he call you from the lifestyle that you were in? Do you think he just called you out of that just to be calling you out of that? And a lot of times we think we're doing it for a particular reason, but really what God is doing is he's raising you up, perhaps to help the next generation or to help someone else that may travel this road again. He's calling him. And so how do we embrace God's will? By looking at this example. We see first that, notice what is happening in verse 20. When the mantle fell on him, when he threw the cloak on him, notice what Elijah does. He left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and mother, and then I'll follow thee. So in order for us to embrace God's will in our life, there's times in our life where we have to release that which God is calling us from. Again, he left it. We have to release it. Notice that he didn't delay in it. Notice that he said, wait a minute, I got to think about this. He understood that it was God who was calling him, and he did not hesitate or delay in that. But oftentimes what we find is when God is calling us away from some things, and let's take away, sometimes I fashion my messages to fit recovery and things like that, but you guys are not going to just be in this place. I want to teach you now. Let's move a little higher. Okay? You've already left the Minervas, right? You already left there. And I don't want to keep circling this thing over and over again. You guys already know that you're in recovery, whatever. But there's also another step. Okay? You already conquered that part. You already left that lifestyle alone. But now as you moving forward in life, there's going to be some things. You might be at Family Dollar now and you're moving up to be manager, but how do you know in 2 years God is going to say, come away from there. I got something else for you to do. We can't be so tied to some things because that's all we know, or that's what we're comfortable with because we can't see ourselves doing anything else other than here.
That's true.
What if I would have went to God and said, Lord, I only got a GED. Look who all the people, not just here, the people at Minerva, the people that I teach on at Bible study and all that. What if I would have said, I can't do this because all I have is a GED? Look who all is counting. When I come on at 7 p.m., there is people counting on me. And you want me to tell you how I know?
Yeah.
It's because 2 weeks ago, I had trouble getting on, and I was getting text messages like, hey, we having it. But if I would have never answered the call of God to move forward in my calling, there's people attached to what it is that God is calling you to. Whatever that is, there's somebody attached to your calling that needs you. And no, everybody is not going to be called to preach, but some of you may be.
Yeah.
And so again, we can't be so attached to our current state that we can't move on a little bit higher. And sometimes it requires us to release it. He released it, right?
Yeah.
But not only did he release it, but notice what he does in 21. Well, let me finish in 20. Verse 20, it says that he left the oxen and he ran after Elijah and he says, I pray thee, let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, go back, what have I done to thee? And he returned. So he returned back from Elijah, because remember, he wanted to kiss his mom and dad goodbye. So he returns back, but notice what else he does. It's not enough just to release the situation or the thing or the people that he's calling us away, because there's also, as you're starting this new life, there's some people that God is going to call you away from. And again, he's calling him away from this job, this occupation. It doesn't mean that something is wrong with it. It's the fact remains that it is no longer going to serve him. It doesn't mean it has to be bad, because a lot of times, especially when we're in recovery, we have this thing where we're leaving some bad people behind. It's not necessarily that we just have to leave them behind. There's also some other people that we're going to have to leave behind, or some other things that we leave behind, and it has nothing to do with your you call it active addiction, right? Yeah. It has nothing to do when you were actively addicted or your addiction. There's just going to be some people that are you're just kind of called away from. There's some people that you're outgrowing. He's he's elevating him to a new level. And so it's not enough just to release it, but now he goes back and notice what he's doing. Look at his action. He took the yoke of oxen and he slew them. That means he killed them. He boiled them, meaning he cooked them. With the instrument, he boiled their flesh with the instruments of oxen and gave it unto the people. So he not only took the oxen, he took the instruments. And what is happening here? What is he doing? He's ridding himself of this. And I talked about this in Bible study with Hannah in the book of Samuel, when she had made a vow to the Lord to give, if he blessed her with a son, she was going to give him back to her. And what we talked about in Bible study, how she took him to the house of the Lord, she presented him to Eli, meaning she released him, but she also took some other steps. She not only released him, she presented him, and then she released him, and then she left. But here in this text, not only did he release the oxen, he went back, but he went back to destroy that very thing that God was calling him from, or going somewhere. So it's not enough just to release it. Sometimes what we have to do in order to embrace God's will is we must rid ourselves of even the possibility of returning to it. For instance, it's not enough to stop smoking the crack, but also we have to get rid of the paraphernalia. It's not enough to quit smoking the weed. We got to get rid of the blunt papers, right? It's not enough to, do you smoke meth or do you shoot meth? It's not enough to smoke or shoot meth. You got to get rid of the paraphernalia. It's not enough to leave these unhealthy relationships. You got to get rid of the phone number. Are y'all with me? It's not enough just to release it, because as long as it's there, there's still a possibility that you'll return back to it, right or wrong.
Right.
Let the church say amen.
Amen.
Right.
Amen.
So again, he's released it, then he went back to it. Again, because sometimes we can release some things that God is calling us out of, but then sometimes we run back to it. But he didn't run back to it to start going behind it again. He ran back to it to get rid of it. And there's times in our lives where God is calling us from some things, and it's not enough to just release it, but we also must rid ourselves of those things, that so in order for us never to return to it again.
Right. It's all right.
But not only did he release it in order to embrace God's will, not only did he rid himself of it so he wouldn't return back to it, but also notice look at what he's doing again. He gave it to the people, the flesh and stuff, the oxen after he cooked it to eat. But then it says, then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered to him. What is happening here? Again, he released the occupation. He ridded himself of the occupation. But then when it says he arose and went after Elijah, that means he rose to the occasion. What do you mean by that? He rose. How many have ever heard the term he rise to the occasion?
Yeah.
Right? That means that he was willing to embrace the call of God, not in just words, but in deed, because he got up. He rose to the occasion. He was willing to embrace the assignment that God has for him. So in order for us to, as we look at the life of Elisha and the call that is on his life, we notice that God called him from in order to call him to. He released what was. He rid himself of it. And not only did he rid himself of it, he rose to the occasion. But that's not the only thing that we should think about today. That's how we can use some wisdom of embracing God's will. But also there's one thing that we're all being called to do. Whether we're black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whether we're women or men. We're all called to leave a life of sin. We're all called from the world in order to, God is calling us from a place, he's calling us from the world in order he's taking us into the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, ma'am.
And we can all agree to that.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? He's calling. That means that he's not calling us from the world like he's going to put us in this place. We're still going to be in the world, but we don't have to be of it. Meaning that our behaviors will change. Meaning that when we're followers of Jesus Christ, we're going to pattern our lives after Jesus Christ. Meaning that he's calling us from worldly things, right? But he's calling us to his kingdom, right? And so, how to embrace God's will? Release, rid, and rise to the occasion. I know it's a lot to think about, right? But guess what the good news is? Jesus answered his call, right? Because you know what he was called from? Remember when he was walking the earth? When he turned 30, he started ministering, right? And he was healing the sick, and he was raising dead people, he was casting out demons. But guess what? One day, God called him from that to the cross of Calvary. Right? Because he had a greater assignment. It was God's will for his son to go to the cross of Calvary. And he went to the cross of Calvary, not just for me, not just for you, but all humankind. He went for all of us. He bled, suffered, and died on the cross of Calvary to reconcile us back to the Father. And he stayed there until he died. And then he was buried in a borrowed tomb. And on the third day morning, he rose with all power. But guess what? He called him from the grave. He ascended to heaven. But then he's calling him back again. And he's coming back again for all of us who are saved in him. And that is the good news. So again, how to embrace God's will? Release that thing that God is calling us from. Rid ourselves of those things to never return. And rise to the occasion. Because if you continue to read this story, if you continue to read this text, you will notice that he did indeed become what God called him to be. But guess what? He was even greater than his successor. And so, that concludes our message today. I'm on my way to Minerva. Amen?